Hello, everybody. This recording is going to be for Biology Module 12, and that module covers phylum Arthropoda. So just to refresh our memories, we started the last module we talked about vertebrates and invertebrates, and then we did several different phyla that were members of that were invertebrates. So you'll remember that the vast majority of the animal kingdom are invertebrates, and the phylum that we're getting ready to do, which is phylum Arthropoda, makes up the majority of invertebrates. So the majority of the animal kingdom are invertebrates, and the majority of invertebrates belong to phylum Arthropoda. So this includes this phylum Arthropoda includes things like crayfish, lobsters, spiders, and insects. So if we took all of the other members of the animal kingdom combined, phylum Arthropoda would include more animals than all of the others combined. So it's obviously a very large number of animals. There are many different organisms that are members of Arthropoda, but they do have some things in common. And so we're going to begin by talking about some of those common characteristics of all members of phylum Arthropoda. So the first one is that all members of phylum Arthropoda have an exoskeleton. So an exoskeleton is a covering on the body. It's usually made of a substance that is called chitin. And its role is to provide support and to provide protection. And it's tough to provide that protection, but it also is flexible so that it allows for movement. The exoskeleton is made by a part of the body that is called the epidermis, which is similar to our skin, but our skin grows as we grow, but that is not true of the exoskeleton. The exoskeleton does not grow as the animal grows, so arthropods have to shed their exoskeleton and replace it with a new one. And there's it's kind of an interesting process by which that happens. One is that the first thing that happens is that there are enzymes that eat away at the exoskeleton. So the old exoskeleton gets broken down by these enzymes. And then the second thing that happens is that the animal's body then takes on water, so that they essentially swell up by taking on that water. And that does two things. One is that it causes the exoskeleton to break away and fall off. So the old exoskeleton breaks away and falls off. But the other thing that it does is that it temporarily makes the organism larger. So it makes the animal larger, at least temporarily, during this time when it has taken on additional water. So then the third thing that happens, and I've run out of room, so I'm going to have to erase some of this, and I'll put number 3 up above here. The third thing that happens then is that a new exoskeleton is formed under the old one. So because that new exoskeleton was formed on the animal after it had taken on water, the animal is larger, and therefore it has room to grow into its new exoskeleton. And these animals will molt several times throughout their lifetime. So unlike our skin that grows with us, the exoskeleton has to be shed and a new, bigger one formed in order for the organism to be able to continue to grow. Okay, so the first characteristic of arthropods are that they have this exoskeleton. Okay, the second one is that their body is comprised of segments. And generally speaking, members of phylum Arthropoda have 3 body segments. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So the thorax is generally analogous to like the chest area of an animal, and then the lower portion is called the abdomen. However, sometimes in some organisms, the head and the thorax are sometimes combined into one segment, and that's called a cephalothorax. And then the animal would still have an abdomen. So generally it's 3 body segments, but there are some organisms that have 2 body segments when the head and the thorax are combined into one. Okay, so those are the first 2 characteristics of arthropods. The third one is that they have jointed appendages. So the word arthropod literally means joint-footed. So their legs um, have joints in them. So this is a difference. One way that arthropods are different from humans or other mammals is that the muscles of an arthropod are underneath the exoskeleton. So those muscles move the joints from underneath. Our muscles are on top of our skeleton, so the muscles move the skeleton from on top. And when we look at individual organisms, we'll look more specifically at the jointed appendages that they have. Okay, a fourth characteristic of all members of phylum Arthropoda is that they have a ventral nervous system. And what that means is that the nerve cord, so remember ventral is like, it's like the bottom side of the body or the stomach side of the body. So this means that their nerve cord is placed at the bottom of the body. And that is important because then you have the exoskeleton above it. So the exoskeleton protects the important nerve cord. There are other components of the nervous system that include things like antenna. So they would be part of the nervous system of these organisms. We'll look at the crayfish and its antenna, but the antenna, they give information to the nervous system, they feed information to the nerve cord about things like touch, taste, smell, other sensory information that gets gets channeled from the antenna to the nerve cord. And then of course the eye also is an important structure that gives information to the nervous system. And in these organisms, some of these organisms have a compound eye, which means that the eye is made up of many lenses. And some of them have a simple eye, which means that the eye is comprised of only one lens. And as we talk about different organisms, we'll point out which ones are comprised of which ones have simple lenses and which ones have compound lenses. Okay, so that's 4 characteristics of all arthropods. A 5th characteristic of all arthropods is they have what is called an open circulatory system. And what we mean by an open circulatory system is that the heart pumps blood into these short blood vessels, and then the blood vessels empty the blood into different areas of the body. So essentially you have these short blood vessels And then that blood, the blood gets emptied into areas of the body from those blood vessels. So in other words, the important thing with regard to an open circulatory system is that the blood comes in direct contact with the different parts of the body. So the cells are in direct contact with blood. That's different from the circulatory system of mammals. We have a closed circulatory system, and the blood within mammals, the blood never leaves the blood vessels. So the blood is circulated throughout the body, and when it reaches the cells where the nutrients and oxygen are needed, the nutrients and the oxygen leave the blood and go to the cells, but the blood itself never leaves the blood vessels. In an open circulatory system, the cells are in direct contact with the blood. So the blood actually leaves the blood vessels and bathes the tissues, bathes the cell with the blood. And we'll see how that works when we look at different organisms. Okay, so those are the 5 main characteristics of all members of phylum Arthropoda. So if we want to list those all on one page, they all have an exoskeleton. Secondly, make sure I do them in the right order. They are comprised of body segments, whether that's 2 body segments or 3 body segments, but they all have body segments. They have jointed appendages. They have a ventral nervous system, so the nervous system is on the underside of their body, and thereby protected by the exoskeleton above. And then lastly, they have an open circulatory system. Okay, so now let's look at the first class within phylum Arthropoda, and that is going to be class Crustacea. And hopefully within a few weeks we will be getting together in person, and we will be dissecting a member of class Crustacea, which is called a crayfish. So you've probably heard of crayfish. They are also sometimes called crawfish or crawdads. Those are all referring to the same organism. These are freshwater organisms, so they don't live in a marine environment. They don't live in salt water. They live in fresh water. So let's for the crayfish, let's look at some of its characteristics relative to the characteristics that we looked at for all members of phylum Arthropoda. So one characteristic of crayfish is that they have a cephalothorax. So they have just two body segments. The head and the thorax are combined into one, and then they have their abdomen. If you could open your books to page 365. I don't have this figure to put up, so you can open your book to page 365 and look at figure 12.2 as we talk through the external structures of the crayfish. Okay, so you'll notice there on figure 12.2 there is the cephalothorax, and then the abdomen is also labeled. So just two body segments. The other thing I want to point out is that the crayfish, the cephalothorax is covered by like a plate of tissue that is called the carapace. And if you look at that figure, you can see that carapace that covers the cephalothorax. You'll also notice that the abdomen is actually divided into 6 segments, and it's covered. It also is covered by an exoskeleton. So there's a hard protective coating over the abdomen. When we dissect the crayfish, you'll see that underneath the abdomen is actually the part of the crayfish that we eat. When you eat a crayfish, you're actually eating the muscles that are part of the abdomen when you eat a crayfish. So, but that muscle is covered by this exoskeleton. And then you'll notice that at the back of the crayfish, there is kind of a tail-like structure that includes a telson and uropods. Those are used for swimming. Okay, so that's the cephalothorax and the carapace. Let's look now at what we would consider the appendages of the crayfish. So the crayfish actually has different types of appendages, and the first ones I'll point out that are probably the most obvious are called the cheilipeds. So the cheilipeds are those appendages that you might refer to them as the claws or the pinchers of the crayfish, and those are really used for they're used to fight. So they're used for defense. They're also used to capture prey. Okay, then you'll notice that the crayfish has walking legs. And that those are used just for the crayfish to walk on land, and also if they also will walk along the bottom of a lake or a river. So the walking legs are used for that. Then there are some appendages that are called swimmerets. And these, as their name implies, are used for swimming, but they are also used for reproduction. So one way that you can tell a male crayfish from a female crayfish is by looking looking at the swimmerets because the first two sets of swimmerets in a male are larger than they are in the female. And in a male, the swimmerets are used to transfer sperm to the female. And in a female, the swimmerets are, they hold the eggs. And then also, once those eggs are fertilized, the female swimmerets also hold the developing crayfish. So they hold the young until those young are big enough to be released into the water and survive on their own. We've already mentioned the uropods and the telsins. I'll write those here. So those are, basically like a flipper. So those are used for swimming. Okay, so those are the main legs, as you will, of the crayfish. The other two appendages that we want to look at are the antenna. So if you look at that figure 12.2, you will notice that there's a set of long antennae. So these are the long ones. And then there is a set of short ones, and those are called attenules. So the long ones are where the crayfish gets taste and touch. So again, remember, these are sensory organs that send information to the ventral nervous system. The shorter ones are also involved in taste and touch. The long ones also are involved in helping the animal maintain balance. And we'll talk about that balance in a little more detail a little bit later. Okay, so those are the appendages that we will find on the crayfish. You'll also see the eye on the crayfish, and they just have a simple eye with a single lens in it. Let's look at the crayfish's respiratory system, because that's one of the main things we'll look at when we do our dissection. So the way that a crayfish gets oxygen from the water is that there are two sets of gills. So there's one set of gills on each side of the crayfish. And those gills extract oxygen from the water. So as the water flows over those gills, the oxygen gets extracted from the water. And we'll see when we look at the crayfish that one of the things we'll notice is that there's a lot of surface area on the gills. So the greater the surface area, the more area that there is to to remove oxygen from the water. One clarification I want to make is that the oxygen that they are breathing from water is oxygen that is dissolved in the water. So you probably are aware that there is an atmosphere above us, and that atmosphere provides a pressure, and that pressure pressing on water causes oxygen to be dissolved in the water. So you also know that water is made of hydrogens and oxygens. So when we say that the crayfish is extracting oxygen from the water, we mean that it's taking that oxygen that is actually dissolved in the water. It's not breaking down water into hydrogens and oxygens, and then breathing this oxygen, because then we would no longer have water. So it's the oxygen that is dissolved in the water that the gills are extracting from them. The crayfish also have a small area that is called a gill chamber, and in that gill chamber they are able to store a small amount of water. So that allows the crayfish to leave the water for short periods of time, but then once the oxygen in that water has all been used up, then they would have to return to the water. But it does allow them to leave the water and go on land for a small amount of time. Now, I just realized something that I forgot to say when we were talking about the appendages on a crayfish, and that is that. So let's go back just briefly to those appendages, the legs. So in a crayfish, every appendage has like a double membrane on them, and what that allows is that if a crayfish loses one of their appendages, this double membrane will seal off the hole so that the blood stays in the body, and then they can regenerate a new appendage. And this is particularly common with the cheilopeds, those claws. They often will lose a cheiloped when they are defending themselves or when they're capturing prey, but they are able to repair themselves by regeneration. So in this case, the regeneration is a means of repairing the body. It's not a means of reproducing. So remember, we saw with some of the worms we looked at in the last module, regeneration can actually be a way of reproducing. In this case, it's just a means of repairing appendages. Okay, let's go ahead then and talk about the circulatory system, and I'm trying to get a figure up here to do that. So sorry that took a little bit longer, but before talking about the circulatory system, I wanted to get a figure up there so that we can look at it together. So this is a figure of the internal anatomy of a crayfish. And right now we're just going to look at the circulatory system. Within the circulatory system, remember that the crayfish has an open circulatory system, which means that the blood is going to come in direct contact with the body tissues. So in that open circulatory system, this structure right here is the heart. So this heart, the part that I am circling is the heart, and you'll notice that the heart is, it sits inside the structure that is called a pericardial sinus. So a sinus is like an opening. We have sinuses in our heads to help decrease the weight of the skull. So in a crayfish, the heart sits inside this pericardial cavity, and you'll notice that the heart has these openings in it. So I'm going to mark those. There's actually 3 openings that are in the heart of a crayfish, and so this pericardial sinus is filled with blood, and then that blood can be taken up into the heart through these holes that are in the heart. Then once that blood is in the heart, then it gets pumped out of the heart through these blood vessels. So all of these red structures are the blood vessels that pump the blood throughout the heart. And then notice that those blood vessels then carry the blood to various body cavities, and once the blood is in those body cavities, it actually leaves the blood vessels and comes in direct contact with every cell. It gives the cell its oxygen and nutrients, and it removes the carbon dioxide from those cells and returns it to the heart, and then it can get reoxygenated by the gills. Once the blood has bathed the tissues and the oxygen has been extracted, then it gets collected by the blood vessels, and it actually gets carried by the blood vessels. It passes by the gills on its way back to the heart, back to the pericardial sinus, and back to the heart, so that it can pick up more oxygen, and it can also get rid of the carbon dioxide waste. The other structure that I will mention here with regard to blood is this structure that is called the green gland, because the blood also will travel through this green gland, and what the green gland does is it cleans out other impurities. So the green gland in crayfish does a similar job as our liver or our kidneys. So our blood travels through our liver, and impurities are cleaned out of the blood in the liver. Our blood also travels through our kidneys, and impurities get removed from the blood in the kidneys as well. Let get that figure back up again. One thing to remember about an open circulatory system is that an open circulatory system depends on gravity for it to work. So that means that in order for the blood to be carried from the heart to these other areas, there's not a lot of pumping action by the heart like our heart pumps. So the animal relies on gravity to get the blood to these other parts of the body. And that means that the animal's movement is somewhat restricted because if the animal is on its back, the blood flow is going to be impeded, and tissues, especially in this lower part of the body, would die because they're not getting enough oxygen and not getting enough nutrients. That's not true of animals with a closed circulatory system. So animals with a closed circulatory system, like mammals, are able to stay on their back for long periods of time without affecting blood flow. But in animals with an open circulatory system, they cannot stay on their back for long periods of time. And when we discuss the nervous system, we'll talk a little bit more about how the crayfish in particular helps to maintain itself in an upright position so that the blood flow occurs. So that's I think we're going to stop with that part of the crayfish. We'll finish up the next week with that. But let me just do a quick review. Okay, so in terms of the cardiovascular system, the heart sits inside this pericardial cavity, and the blood collects in the pericardial sinus, and then it can go into the heart through these holes. Then from there, based mainly by gravity, the blood then travels in blood vessels to the various tissues and cells of the body. Once the blood travels to those particular parts of the body, the blood actually leaves the body tissue, the blood vessels, and bathes the body tissues directly with the blood. Then that blood gets collected again in this structure that is called the sternal sinus. And you'll notice then that sternal sinus is going to carry the blood back to the pericardial cavity. And on its way, that blood is going to pass by the gills, where it will get rid of carbon dioxide waste, and it'll pick up oxygen. And then it collects in the pericardial sinus again, flows into the heart, and then gets moved out to those body tissues once again. The blood will also flow through the green gland, and it gets cleansed of impurities when it flows through the green gland. Okay, so I think we'll stop there today, which leaves us with the digestive system and the nervous system and reproductive system yet to do for the crayfish. We'll do those next week, or the week after spring break, and then we will also do class Arachnida, which is spiders, and we will do class Insecta, which includes all the insects of the animal kingdom.